I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The idea of getting away from everything, a cabin tucked in the woods far from anyone, was exactly what I needed. No noise, no city lights, just peace. At least that's what I thought. I rented the cabin online, sight unseen. The photos showed a rustic little place, a log cabin surrounded by trees, with a roaring fireplace and a wraparound porch. The place seemed perfect, and the price was too good to pass up. I packed my bags, filled up the car with food, water, and some supplies, and left on a Friday evening. The drive took longer than I expected. The further I went, the less familiar the roads became. I found myself driving down winding paths through dense forests. The sun had already set by the time I reached the last stretch of road, and the only light was from my headlights, casting long, eerie shadows on the trees. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it. The cabin. It was just as the pictures had promised. Charming, quiet, isolated. There were no neighbors, no lights from other houses. Just trees, rocks, and this small wooden cabin sitting peacefully at the edge of a clearing. I pulled the car into the gravel driveway, the crunch of the stones beneath the tires breaking the silence. I parked and sat there for a moment, taking in the stillness. It was almost unsettling how quiet it was. Not even the usual sounds of crickets or wind rustling the leaves. Just nothing. Shaking off the feeling, I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The door was unlocked, and I stepped into the dimly lit interior. The cabin smelled like old wood and a faint scent of pine, which I figured was from the surrounding forest. There was a fireplace to the left, with a stack of firewood neatly arranged beside it. A small kitchen area to the right with a simple dining table and chairs. It was cozy, and for a moment, I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was everything I needed for the weekend. I unpacked, laid out some things in the small bedroom, and made sure the fire in the fireplace was going. The warmth from the flames was comforting as I sank into the armchair by the fire, a book in hand. I thought about cooking dinner, but decided to keep it simple. A sandwich would do. I wasn't in the mood to get fancy. By the time I finished eating, the sun had completely set, and the world outside was covered in darkness. I turned on the small lamp beside the couch, the low light flickering on the walls. The night felt strange. There was something off about the silence, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It felt as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shrugged it off and settled into bed around midnight, trying to push away the feeling of unease. It was just me, the forest, and a weekend of solitude. There was nothing to fear, I kept telling myself. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the first light of dawn began creeping through the windows. The forest outside was bathed in a soft, golden glow. The air was crisp, and I could hear the distant call of birds. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful again. I brewed some coffee and stepped outside, breathing in the fresh morning air. The ground was covered with a light dusting of frost, and everything around me seemed still. As I stood on the porch, I noticed something strange. A trail of footprints in the snow leading toward the woods. The prints were fresh, the snow around them still undisturbed. They were too large to be from an animal, and they didn't look like they belonged to anyone I knew. I frowned and stepped closer to the edge of the porch. The tracks led deep into the woods, disappearing into the thicket of trees. For a moment, I thought about following them, but something in my gut told me not to. Could have just been someone else staying nearby, or maybe a neighbor taking a walk, but the isolation of the place started to feel oppressive. I turned away from the tracks, pushing the thought out of my mind, and decided to explore the cabin's surroundings instead. The morning passed slowly as I hiked around, taking in the peacefulness. The air smelled like earth, and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots was the only sound. By late afternoon, I had walked a little farther than I intended. As I made my way back to the cabin, I found myself in a part of the woods I didn't recognize. The trees were thicker here, and the light seemed dimmer, as if the canopy above was blocking the sun. I should have turned back sooner, but I didn't want to admit I was lost. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Great. I tried retracing my steps, but every direction I took seemed to lead me further into the forest. The trees were taller now, the ground uneven, and I realized with a chill that I hadn't seen another human being all day. It was like I had wandered into a part of the world that was forgotten by time. My heart started to race as I quickened my pace, trying not to panic. I told myself to stay calm, that I'd find my way back. But as the sun started setting and the shadows grew longer, I began to feel the weight of the isolation press down on me. I wasn't just lost, I was completely alone. As the night crept in, I finally stumbled upon a clearing. My breath hitched when I saw it. A small, decrepit cabin, similar to the one I had rented. The sight made my stomach turn. I had been walking for hours, and I was sure I hadn't seen this place on my hike earlier. I approached cautiously, my footsteps making little noise on the forest floor. The cabin was old, the wood rotting in places, and the windows were shattered. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking in the wind. Something felt wrong, like I shouldn't be here, but there I was, standing in front of this old, abandoned structure in the middle of nowhere. The feeling of dread was suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the nagging curiosity. I stepped closer to the door and pushed it open. The inside was empty, save for dust and a few broken pieces of furniture. It looked like no one had lived here for years. But then I noticed something strange. Scattered across the floor were pieces of paper, old photographs, crumpled notes, and torn pages from books. The one that caught my attention, however, was a single, faded letter, half buried beneath the debris. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The letter was short, almost too brief to make sense of. It was written in a hurried, scrawled handwriting. Undersir, I shouldn't have come. They're watching. They know. If you find this, don't stay here. Leave. They're always close. You're not alone. Underscore, I felt a chill run through me as I read the words. The cabin seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with an unshakable sense of danger. The letter was a warning, but who had written it and why? My mind raced as I stood there in the dark, my pulse pounding in my ears. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my shallow breaths. Then I heard something, a sound, no, a movement, the faintest rustle of leaves, just outside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I snapped my head toward the door, and that's when I saw them. Figures in the shadows of the trees, barely visible but unmistakable. They were watching me. Panic surged through me as I bolted for the door. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I didn't have time to figure it out. I ran blindly, tripping over branches, pushing through the underbrush, and barely able to keep my bearings. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. Couldn't let them catch me. I don't know how long I ran for, but by the time I finally collapsed near a stream, gasping for breath, the figures had disappeared. I sat there, trembling, the cold water at my feet grounding me as I tried to calm myself. It was all too much. Eventually, I made my way back to the cabin, exhausted and terrified. The entire day felt like a blur, a nightmare I couldn't escape. I didn't know what had happened or who was out there, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. The next morning, I packed my things, got in the car, and drove out of there faster than I ever thought possible. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small diner and used a phone to call the rental company. They were confused when I explained what happened, insisting that the cabin I had rented was the only one on the property. There was no other cabin. I didn't argue. I don't know who or what was in those woods, But I do know this: I'll never go back. Some places are best left forgotten, and some warnings are meant to be heeded. The cabin was supposed to be the escape I needed: quiet, peaceful, an isolated retreat from the noise of the world. I had been stressed for months. Work had been piling up, personal issues were weighing me down, and I was constantly surrounded by people, noise, and chaos. I needed to get away, to find somewhere where I could think and breathe and reconnect with myself. So I rented a cabin deep in the woods. The location was remote, far from the nearest town, a good hour's drive on dirt roads. The moment I saw the pictures online, I felt like it was the perfect place. A small log cabin with a stone fireplace, a big window facing the woods, and a wraparound porch. I could already imagine myself sitting there with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise. I arrived around dusk, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky a deep orange. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, the trees surrounding the cabin swaying gently in the wind. There was no one else around for miles, just the soft rustling of the leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional crunch of twigs underfoot as I walked up to the cabin. The key was left under the mat as promised. It was an old key, the kind that looked like it belonged in a time-worn chest rather than a modern door lock. I unlocked the door, and the smell of wood and cedar hit me immediately. The place was cozy, rustic, with wooden beams above me and simple furniture. The large stone fireplace stood in the center of the living room, an inviting touch for the chilly nights to come. There was a small kitchen to my right with a refrigerator stocked with some basic essentials: eggs, milk, butter, and a few cans of soup. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, I could relax. After unpacking my things, I decided to take a walk around the property. The land stretched out for acres, dense with trees on every side, the forest thick and untamed. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, where a tiny creek trickled through the rocks. The evening was peaceful. I stood there, taking in the beauty of it all: the fresh air, the quiet, the natural world untouched by human hands. There was something calming about it. As I walked further, I noticed something odd. About 100 yards from the cabin, in the direction of the creek, there was a large, rusted metal object. At first, I thought it was just a piece of old farm equipment or a forgotten tool. But as I got closer, I realized it was much stranger. It was a heavy metal door, like the kind you would see on a storm shelter or an underground bunker, half buried in the earth. The door was crooked, leaning to one side, and covered in moss and vines. There were no other buildings around, just this strange door standing there in the middle of the forest. I took a step back, trying to process what I was seeing. The door seemed completely out of place. It was old, but not old enough to seem like part of the natural landscape. Someone had put it there, but why? What was it doing here? I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off. There was no reason to be alarmed. It was probably just some kind of relic left over from when the land had been used for something else, maybe a farm or a military installation. I didn't want to let it spoil the peaceful mood, so I turned back toward the cabin. The walk back was uneventful, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun had fully set, leaving only the faintest glow on the horizon. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and decided to cook something simple for dinner: a couple of eggs scrambled with some butter and toast. Nothing fancy. The cabin grew colder as the night went on. The fire in the fireplace crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I settled into the armchair by the fire, sipping on a glass of wine, trying to shake off the unease I had felt earlier. I didn't want to overthink things. It was probably nothing, just some old junk that had been left behind. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started with small things: the occasional creak of the floorboards, the faintest sound of something moving outside, just beyond the windows. At first, I thought it was the wind or the house settling, but then the sounds started to grow more pronounced. A scraping noise like something dragging across the porch. A distant thud, like a door slamming in the woods. I stood up and peered through the window, but there was nothing outside. No movement. The clearing was empty, the trees still. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I hadn't been alone in a place like this for a long time, and the isolation was bound to make me jumpy. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the sounds kept coming. It was subtle at first, like the wind whistling through the trees, but the longer I listened, the more it felt deliberate. Something was out there. I could feel it. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, thinking I could put my mind at ease by checking the porch, maybe the door. But the moment I stepped outside, the air was thick with silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong. The kind where every breath you take sounds too loud, too out of place. I shone the flashlight around, first on the porch, then toward the woods. The beam of light bounced off the trees, cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing there. No movement.
No sounds.
I felt stupid standing there, flashlight in hand, feeling like I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made my way back inside, locking the door behind me. I sat in front of the fireplace, my heart pounding. The sounds had stopped for now, but the unease lingered. The silence seemed heavier now, more oppressive. I tried to read a book, but my mind kept wandering. What was out there? Was someone watching me? I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the fire, but eventually, I heard something again. A loud knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there. I stood up, frozen for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I grabbed the flashlight again, my fingers trembling. I felt the urge to run, to get out of the cabin, but I knew that wasn't an option. There was nowhere to go, not for miles. I approached the door slowly, my hand reaching for the knob. My mind raced with questions. Who could it be? There were no other cabins nearby. There wasn't another soul for miles. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the door. There was no one there. The night air hit me, cold and biting, but the porch was empty. I scanned the surrounding trees with the flashlight, the beam bouncing off the dark trunks, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone having been there. My pulse was racing, and I felt a sharp pang of panic in my chest. I closed the door quickly, bolted it, and leaned against it for a moment. What was going on? My mind raced. Was it someone playing a prank? But it didn't make sense. Why would anyone come out here, so far from civilization, just to knock on the door and disappear? I spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert. I kept the lights on, the doors locked, and the fireplace burning. I didn't sleep. Not really. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow felt like something waiting to pounce. The next morning, I decided to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was no longer safe. As I packed my things, I kept thinking about that metal door I had seen the day before. What was it? Why was it there? I couldn't explain it, but I knew I needed to get out. As I drove away from the cabin, the woods stretching out behind me, I felt a strange sense of relief. Whatever had been watching me, whatever had been lurking in the shadows, was now far behind me. I couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation getting to me, but I didn't think so. There was something out there, something I couldn't understand, and I wasn't ever going back to that cabin again. It had been a long drive, the kind of drive where you start doubting the wisdom of your choices. My hands gripped the wheel a little tighter as the road narrowed. I had been driving for hours, barely passing another car, the landscape becoming more and more desolate with each mile. Trees, just trees. Thick forests closing in on either side, the road barely visible beneath the shadows. Part of me started wondering if I'd gone too far. I could still turn around, head back, and forget about the whole thing. But no, I'd made the decision to come up here. A weekend getaway to get away from it all. I hadn't planned on being so isolated, but the place I rented had seemed perfect on paper. A little cabin in the woods, far from any city or town. Silence, peace. Maybe I could finally clear my head. Eventually, I pulled into a small clearing and saw the cabin ahead. It was tucked into the trees, almost blending in with the landscape. It looked like something out of an old postcard, the kind of place people put up on their walls to represent serenity. Wooden walls, a small porch with an old rocking chair, and windows framed by ivy. It was perfect, almost too perfect. I parked the car and grabbed my bag. The door creaked when I opened it, and I paused for a second to take it all in. Inside, everything was exactly how I imagined. Rustic, cozy, the kind of place that felt like it had been sitting there for decades. A stone fireplace, dark oak furniture, a plush couch that invited you to sink in and never leave. There was a smell of pine, a little musty, but in a good way. Natural, like nature had seeped inside. I set my things down on the table and looked around. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees outside. It felt like the kind of silence that could eat you alive if you let it. I had planned on settling in for the night, just getting comfortable. Maybe reading a book or watching the sunset from the porch. But something was bothering me. There was a sense of heaviness in the air. It was hard to put into words, but the place felt like it was holding its breath. I pushed the thought aside and went to the kitchen to start dinner. As I chopped vegetables for a simple stew, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. Not the usual quiet of a rural area, this was different. There were no birds, no animals. The forest had gone completely still, as though it were waiting for something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. After I ate, I decided to head out onto the porch. The air was cooler now, and the sun was dipping behind the trees. It cast a golden glow across the clearing, making everything look soft and inviting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The stillness of the forest was unnerving, like everything was holding its breath. I sat in the rocking chair, trying to shake off the sense of unease. It didn't work. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. From the corner of my eye, I could see movement in the trees. Something watching me. I looked again, but it was gone. Maybe a deer or something, but there was something wrong about it. I stood up, my feet scraping the old wooden floor of the porch. My stomach tightened. There was no sound from the forest, just the same heavy silence. I had seen something. I was sure of it. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like the right thing to do. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts. That night, I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The bed was soft, and the room was dark, but the silence outside was deafening. I kept hearing little noises, rustling in the trees, something scraping across the roof. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing. No animal, no person, nothing. I finally fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, but my sleep was fitful. I dreamt of the trees, their branches like twisted fingers reaching down toward me. In the dream, I was running through the forest, the branches grabbing at my clothes, pulling me deeper. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I didn't dare look out the window this time. I didn't want to know what was out there, but I couldn't help it. I pulled back the curtain just a little and peered into the darkness. Nothing, just trees. But then I saw it. A shadow, a figure standing just beyond the trees. Not moving, just standing there, staring at the cabin. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. It was gone. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced. Was I just tired? Had I imagined it? But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to leave. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. I grabbed my bag and made for the door, but just before I stepped outside, I stopped. Something caught my eye. There, on the porch, was a small object. A stone. A rock, but not just any rock. It was smooth, unnaturally so, and it glowed faintly in the light. I picked it up, turning it in my hand. It didn't seem like something that belonged in the woods. It felt out of place. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. The air around me felt wrong, and the forest seemed to press in closer. I turned and left the cabin without looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every twist in the road, every turn of the wheel, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind me. The roads were empty, but I couldn't relax. My mind kept returning to that figure in the trees, to the way the air had felt heavy, like it was about to crack open. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, and even then, I couldn't fully breathe until I was inside a small diner, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the chill I felt inside. I ordered coffee and sat down, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been too tired, too isolated. But the thing I couldn't shake was the rock. I set it down on the table, turning it over in my hands again. As I looked at it, I realized something. It wasn't just smooth. It wasn't just glowing faintly. It had marks on it, carvings, strange, angular shapes that seemed almost deliberate, like something or someone had made them. I left the diner after a while, my hands still holding the rock. The sun had come up, and the town felt safer, more normal. I kept thinking about the cabin, the figure in the trees. I'd never been one to believe in anything supernatural, but there was something about that place that didn't sit right. Something about it felt wrong from the moment I arrived. When I got home, I put the rock on my desk, still trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't even know how to explain it. It wasn't until weeks later, when I was researching something completely unrelated online, that I stumbled across an old local legend. The legend spoke of strange occurrences in the woods, of people disappearing, of strange markings on stones, much like the one I had found. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back to that cabin, ever. But the strangest thing? Every now and then, I would still catch a glimpse of that figure in the trees when I looked outside. Not in person, but in my peripheral vision. Just for a second. Then it would be gone. I guess the forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a break from the noise of everyday life. I'd been working non-stop for weeks and needed something peaceful to recharge. I found a little cabin in the woods, far from the nearest town, with just the right mix of rustic charm and solitude. The owner, a local guy named Jim, had assured me that everything was perfect, that the cabin was well maintained, and that I'd have everything I needed for a relaxing stay. I didn't think much about it at the time, but looking back, I remember his smile, a little too wide, his eyes a little too intense. He mentioned the place being remote more than once. I thought nothing of it at the time. I was too eager to escape the stress of my life. The drive there was peaceful, long stretches of road surrounded by trees, hills rolling in the distance. It felt like the kind of place where time slowed down, where you could breathe easier. But as I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the trees closed in, and a quiet unease started creeping over me. It was almost as if the woods were swallowing the road. I could hear nothing but the hum of my tires on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves. The cabin was small, nestled at the edge of a clearing. It looked charming from a distance. Weathered wood, a chimney with smoke drifting lazily out, and a large porch with a rocking chair that seemed to invite relaxation. When I pulled up, I parked the car and grabbed my bag. The air was cool, the ground a little damp from the morning dew. The door creaked when I opened it, and a wave of musty, old wood hit me. It smelled like nobody had been here for a while. There were no lights on, just the dim glow from the windows and a fireplace in the living room. The interior was as rustic as I'd imagined, cozy, but with that eerie feeling of being completely alone. The furniture was all wood. The floors creaked beneath my feet. I set my bag down and walked through the cabin, checking the rooms. A small kitchen with an old stove, a bathroom with cracked tiles, and a bedroom with a big, heavy bed. Nothing remarkable, just a place to sleep. I unpacked my things and made myself at home. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing outside. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. As I bent down to light it, I noticed something strange. There was a small mark on the floor in front of the hearth, as if something heavy had been dragged across the wood. I shrugged it off. It was an old cabin. It probably had seen a lot of use over the years. The fire crackled to life, filling the cabin with warmth. I sat back in the armchair, enjoying the quiet. The only sound was the occasional pop from the logs in the fire. I had no plans for the evening, just to relax. Maybe read a book or watch the stars from the porch later. But the quiet didn't last. As night fell and the fire grew dimmer, I began to hear sounds coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe animals, deer, raccoons, anything. But then I started hearing something else, something deliberate. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the scurrying of small creatures. This was something heavy, slow, like footsteps. I froze in my chair, the book in my hands forgotten. The steps were faint at first, just a thud, thud in the distance. But they grew closer, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up and moved to the window, peering out into the dark woods. The trees were dense, and the light from the cabin only reached a few feet into the yard. I saw nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. I returned to my seat, trying to calm my nerves. But the sound continued, closer now, and definitely the sound of something walking. My heart was pounding. I got up again and checked the door, making sure it was locked. There was no reason to panic. Could have been anyone, a hunter or a hiker. The woods were full of people, even if it felt like I was alone here. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps were so deliberate, so slow. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was inside. I decided to step outside, just for a moment, to try to make sense of it. Maybe I could find some tracks in the dirt. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The beam of the flashlight swept over the ground, searching for signs. I scanned the yard, the trees, the edges of the clearing. Nothing. I turned to go back inside, but then I heard something else. A branch snapping in the woods, too close. It was like a message. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever it was didn't want me to feel safe. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and sat by the fire, too frightened to sleep. I should have called the owner of the cabin, I thought. But then I remembered his strange smile again, his odd insistence about how remote the place was. I didn't trust him. I didn't trust anyone around here. Hours passed, and the footsteps didn't stop. Every so often, I would hear them, a slow, deliberate thud, like someone pacing around the cabin. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing. The night dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. My head swam with exhaustion and fear. Then, around 3 a.m., something happened. I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard anyone approach. No footsteps, no movement, just the knock, soft, almost polite. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would knock at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and I didn't know anyone in this area. I had to be imagining it. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 sharp taps like a signal. I didn't move, couldn't. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a man's voice. It wasn't a woman's either. It was low, guttural, strange. Said something I couldn't make out. But the words were unmistakable in their tone. It wasn't asking for help. It wasn't trying to engage in conversation. It was a warning. I ran to the window, looking out again, but there was nothing. No movement. No figures in the dark. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. What was going on? Was it just someone trying to mess with me? Or was there something worse lurking in those woods? The hours felt endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I sat by the fire again, holding the flashlight, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. The knocking never came again, but I could still hear the footsteps, still feel the eyes watching me. Something was out there. It wasn't until morning that I felt brave enough to leave the cabin. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the clearing. I grabbed my bag, locked up, and headed back to my car. As I walked past the edge of the clearing, I saw something in the dirt, a set of tracks. They weren't from a person. They were too large, too wide, but they were fresh. My stomach turned as I realized I wasn't the first to be in that cabin. The footprints led away from the porch into the woods, but they didn't stop. They kept going deeper, farther into the trees, until they disappeared into the dark. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I got in my car, started it up, and drove out of the clearing, leaving that cabin behind me. I never spoke to Jim again. I never went back to that cabin. And to this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. But I do know this. It wasn't just my imagination. And I'm thankful every day that I left before whatever it was decided to come inside. It wasn't my idea to come here. My cousin, Jake, had been pushing for months. A weekend in the woods, he kept saying, to escape the noise of the city. I wasn't too keen on it, but I eventually caved. I'd been working too much and needed a break. I figured some time away from technology, the endless buzz of my phone, and the pressure of daily life would do me good. So we rented a small cabin. I won't say I had high expectations, but when I saw the place for the first time, I wasn't thrilled. It wasn't exactly falling apart, but it had the look of something that hadn't been touched in years. The wood had darkened with age, the windows were a little cloudy, and the air inside smelled like old pine and dust. Not exactly inviting, but I wasn't going to complain. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. There was no cell service, just the two of us and the quiet. I should have felt more at ease, but I didn't. I thought I'd be okay. I didn't mind the isolation at first, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a strange feeling crept up on me, the kind that sits in your chest and grows slowly, making your stomach twist. I tried to shake it off. Jake was already starting a fire in the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light. He didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, but I did. The first night wasn't anything out of the ordinary, at least not on the surface. We made dinner, cracked open a couple of beers, and talked about old times. I sat by the fire, the warmth of it relaxing my tense muscles. But there was something off about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your mind wander. Maybe it was the strange creaks and groans of the old cabin. the kind that you don't notice during the day but seem louder when night falls. Or maybe it was the fact that Jake kept looking out the window every few minutes, as though he was expecting something. The second night, things got worse. I don't know if it was because I was already on edge, but when I woke up in the middle of the night, I felt it immediately. The cabin felt wrong. It was colder than it had been when we went to bed, and the silence, it was heavier now. The fire had long since burned out, and the only light was from the faint glow of the moon through the trees. I could see Jake still sleeping on the couch, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it. I got up, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. I walked to the window, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Outside, the forest was dark, the trees swaying in the breeze. But it wasn't just the trees that caught my eye. There was something out there, something moving in the shadows. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then I saw it more clearly. The figure. It wasn't moving like an animal. It was standing tall and thin in the distance between the trees. Couldn't make out any details. It was just a shape, a dark silhouette that didn't belong. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I quickly backed away from the window. I was trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I didn't wake Jake. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. He'd just laugh it off and tell me to get some sleep. But I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes fixed on the window, watching for any sign of movement. By morning, the figure was gone. The sun had risen, casting its pale light over the forest. The cabin felt normal again, almost too normal. I convinced myself I had imagined it, that maybe the shadows of the trees had played tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, we decided to explore the area. Jake was still in high spirits, talking about hiking and finding a good spot to take photos. I agreed, not wanting to seem paranoid. Maybe I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. We spent most of the afternoon walking through the woods, but the feeling never left me. It was like we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from last night standing just behind us. But there was nothing, just the trees, the distant sound of birds, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. We made our way back to the cabin as the sun began to set again. I couldn't help but notice that the atmosphere around us felt heavier, more oppressive. The air was thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. By the time we got back, I was exhausted. I didn't even want to talk to Jake anymore. I just wanted to sleep and forget about everything. That night, things took a turn for the worse. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, faint but persistent. First, I thought it was just the wind, but it kept going, and it was coming from outside the cabin. It sounded like something was dragging along the ground, maybe scraping against the wood or the stone foundation. I got up, my heart racing. The sound stopped as soon as I moved, leaving only the silence in its wake. I stood still for a few moments, straining to listen, but I heard nothing. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was a branch brushing against the cabin. I didn't know, but something told me it wasn't. I went to the window, trying to see if anything was out there, but it was too dark. I couldn't make out anything beyond the blackness of the trees. My pulse quickened as I stared into the night, and then I saw it, the same figure from last night. It was closer this time, standing just outside the cabin, in the shadows of the trees. Its shape was taller than I remembered, thin and unnaturally still. I don't know what made me do it, but I opened the window just a crack. My breath hitched in my throat as I tried to steady my hands. I peered out, hoping to get a better look, but there was nothing. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I closed the window, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I'd had enough. I was ready to go back to civilization, to the noise and the chaos of the city. I didn't care if Jake thought I was overreacting. I needed to leave. But when I went to pack my things, I found something strange. On the table near the door, there was a small note. It wasn't there when we arrived. I was sure of it. It was written in a shaky, uneven hand, the words barely legible. I couldn't make out all of it, but there was one sentence that stood out. "Don't go outside at night." I felt the blood drain from my face. I glanced at Jake, who was in the other room, packing his bag. I thought about telling him what had happened, but I couldn't. Not yet. I didn't want to sound crazy. We left a few hours later, driving back toward the nearest town. I didn't say a word the entire drive. I was too shaken, too confused. I couldn't explain what had happened. I couldn't explain the figure, or the strange noises, or the note. But I knew one thing for sure: whatever it was real. And I was never going back to that cabin. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. I'd always seen those kinds of things in movies and read about them in books, but I never expected it to happen to me. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a simple cabin in the woods, just me, my thoughts, and the wilderness. Nothing more, nothing less. But now I realize how wrong I was to think it would be that simple. I had been planning this trip for months, looking for a place where I could disconnect, take a break from the busy city, and just reset my mind. After some digging around, I found a small cabin in the mountains. It seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, peaceful, just what I needed. I'd rented it from a website that listed private getaways, and after reading some reviews, I felt confident it would be the kind of retreat I'd been craving. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt road that led to the cabin. As I drove deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the fading daylight. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled fresh, a far cry from the stale air of the city. It felt like a world away from everything I knew. When I finally arrived at the cabin, I parked in front of a small, old-fashioned wooden structure. The cabin looked like something out of an old postcard, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a painting, nestled between tall pines with smoke curling up from the chimney. It wasn't huge, but it had a charm to it, a simple, rustic appeal. I unloaded my bags, grabbed the key from the lockbox, and let myself in. Inside, the cabin was cozy. There was a small fireplace, an old couch, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. It didn't bother me, though. In fact, I liked it. It had a lived-in feel, like it had a story to tell. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored the space. There were a few windows with a view of the surrounding forest. Felt quiet, almost too quiet. I unpacked my things, made a quick dinner of canned soup, and sat by the fireplace, feeling the warmth spread across my body. The only sound was the occasional crackling of the fire and the rustle of the wind outside. As night fell, the woods grew darker, and the air seemed to get colder. The temperature dropped quickly, and soon, I found myself wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. I felt strangely at ease here, in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. But then, as the night wore on, something shifted. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a feeling. The kind of feeling you get when you realize you're not quite alone, even though you should be. The silence of the woods became oppressive. The wind howled outside, pushing against the walls of the cabin, making the whole place shake slightly. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. The place was old. It made sense that it would creak and groan. But then, around midnight, I heard something else. A faint scratching noise, like something small and sharp dragging against wood. I froze, the blanket slipping from my shoulders as I strained to listen. It came from the back of the cabin, near the small window that faced the woods. My heart began to race. I stood up slowly, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen against the house, or an animal was passing by. I walked over to the window and peeked through the blinds. Outside, the world was black. The forest stretched on endlessly, nothing but shadows and the occasional flicker of moonlight filtering through the trees. I couldn't see anything. No animal, no movement, nothing. I told myself to relax, that it was just my imagination getting the best of me. But that gnawing feeling didn't go away. I sat back down by the fire, my mind racing, but the noise had stopped. For a while, I was able to calm myself down. I convinced myself it had been nothing, just an animal or maybe the wind after all. But as I settled back into the couch, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I had locked when I arrived, was slightly ajar. Not much, just a crack. Enough to make me feel a chill run down my spine. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. I distinctly remembered checking the door before going to bed. I got up again, my legs shaky, and walked toward the door, half expecting to find someone standing on the other side. But when I opened it, there was nothing. The night air hit me cold in the face. The world outside was as still and quiet as before, except now it felt different, more oppressive, heavier. I closed the door quickly, double-checking the lock. Something wasn't right. I went back to the fire, my mind now racing. The noises, the door, the feeling of being watched. It all added up to something that I couldn't explain. But then again, maybe there was an explanation. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a wild animal had tried to get in through the door, and the wind had made it creak. I had to stop imagining things. But no matter how hard I tried to reassure myself, the unease stayed with me. I didn't want to sleep, but I knew I had to. So, I settled in for the night, trying my best to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. The wind outside picked up again, howling through the trees, making the whole cabin shake. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old wood around me. I don't know when I finally drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't long before I woke up again. I don't know what time it was. Sometime in the early morning, I think, but something woke me up. It wasn't a sound this time, but a presence. The feeling of someone standing there, just beyond my peripheral vision. I snapped my head to the side, but there was nothing there. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the dying fire in the next room. But then I saw it, a shadow moving just outside the window. It was quick, just a glimpse, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Someone or something was out there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to make myself move, but I couldn't. The fear had paralyzed me, and then it happened again. This time, there was no mistaking it. I saw the shadow move closer this time, and I could see something in its shape. A figure, not an animal, not a trick of the light. Person. Someone was outside, moving around the cabin. I grabbed the phone from the nightstand, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. My breath quickened as I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path outside. Whoever it was, they were walking around the cabin, slowly, deliberately. Felt like they were toying with me. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait. But what could I do? I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't have a weapon, and I had no way of defending myself. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out. Should I call the authorities? But even if I could get a signal, they would be hours away. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening, hoping they were just passing through. But then I heard a tapping on the window. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The figure was right there on the other side of the glass. I could barely make out the silhouette, but I could feel their presence, pressing in on me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. But just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The tapping ceased, and the figure moved away from the window. I waited, holding my breath, not daring to move. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I lay there, my body stiff with fear. After what felt like hours, I finally mustered the courage to get out of bed and peek through the blinds again. The figure was gone. The cabin was silent once more, the woods outside still and calm. I couldn't explain it. I didn't understand what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe. I spent the rest of the night awake, keeping watch, never taking my eyes off the windows. The shadows in the woods seemed to move, twisting and shifting in the moonlight, but I saw nothing else. By morning, the tension had started to fade, and the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I had to leave. I wasn't going to stick around to find out if it would happen again. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to make sure I had everything. I just wanted to get out. The cabin felt like a prison now, its walls closing in on me. I locked the door behind me and got in my car, driving away as fast as I could, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. As I made my way down the mountain, I looked back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, silent and still, nestled in the woods. But I knew I'd never come back. I didn't know what had happened, but I wasn't willing to stick around and find out. I've never been back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left unexplained.